Welcome everybody. I'm impressed you found this room all the way back here, and hopefully it's cooling off slightly compared to where it started. This is the working group long-term support deep dive session. We didn't have an intro session or something otherwise in the maintainer track, so this is a little bit deeper detail, kind of a status update on where we are. But basically our working group I kind of summarize with the what are we releasing, why, how is it best integrated, validated, and supported is a broad question. I've come to this because I have been involved in SIG release and the release team for Kubernetes, and from there we semi-regularly got beat up about how we were doing things in terms of our artifact generation and delivery and support. And it kind of caused me to question a bit that. So I am one of the co-organizers of the working group, along with a number of others who didn't happen to be able to make it this week. But yeah, that's the intro. Oh, did I say I'm Tim Pepper? I don't know if I did that. So I'm Tim Pepper. I work for VMware. So what is the working group, first of all? A brief background. Working groups are about discussion and pathfinding and crafting proposals as opposed to owning code, which is what SIGs do, and doing cross-SIG type of work. And obviously support decisions or support questions are ones that then would span multiple SIGs, many stakeholders. The question of how we support Kubernetes as an open source community is going to span all of the SIGs effectively. So we kind of posed this basic question because it kept coming up in the release area, and do we need a longer support stream? Yes or no? And depending on the outcome of that, this working group aims to brainstorm potential solutions to either of those paths. If yes, then as a community, we need to change how we develop and support Kubernetes. If no, we still can't deny the experience of our users, which is that they're having some troubles in this regard. So if you want to find more about the working group, we are in the community repo with all the other ones. You can link there to the mailing list, to the Slack channel, to our regular Zoom meetings that we have every other week. And there's a variety of documents that we are crafting, and I'll have some additional links through the slides. So that's kind of what we're doing. But just to back up very, very briefly, even though this is a deep dive, make sure we're level set. What is LTS? So we got the canonical example, literally the canonical example, Ubuntu folks here in the room in their bright orange shirts. Most people who are familiar with the phrase LTS know it from an Ubuntu perspective. LTS meaning long-term support. But what does that really mean? Ubuntu 14.4, 16.4, what is that? Well, it's a long-term period where you get support, an upgraded path and bug fixes and those sorts of things. And it's a documented support policy. It's not just something arbitrary. It has both aspects of length and type of support. So an LTS might be something that says you get security and bug fixes for 2 years. Or it might be something that says you get bug fixes for 1 year plus another year of critical security fixes. There isn't exactly a thing that is LTS. It's a documented policy. As a project, we have to choose what is the right policy that we can balance what our community can deliver with what end users are looking for. But to make it explicit, long is something longer than a year. There are also short-term support streams that typically exist. So in the Ubuntu case, you know that you have regular releases, and those aren't supported as long. So that's the distinction. That shortness is typically measured in months, where long is typically measured in year or years. So why would you do this? Users are telling us they want to do production deployments and either have them there more stable for longer, or at least have more time to transition between releases or between stable releases. And it takes time to get something rolled out, and you don't want to constantly be churning things underneath your users. Vendors also are trying to figure this out. How do they manage the support through and not churn their customers, but also not have lots of parallel support streams that they're having to manage? If we were to do something once in the open source upstream, all of us vendors who deliver Kubernetes, instead of us 80 times in parallel, because there's like 80 vendors now of Kubernetes, instead of us doing that all redundantly in parallel, maybe we could just admit that there's no value add in doing something that literally everyone does, and let's do it once together with quality in the upstream where the subject matters exist and can validate for sure that as an ecosystem we have the critical security fixes correctly patched. again, using Linux as an analogy, the Linux kernel having LTS support streams and most recently dealing with the Spectre and Meltdown patches, they have had a huge struggle getting those patches with the technical correctness into older support streams. This can be very, very difficult to do, hugely resource intensive. And at the end of the day, there's not a lot of value add for a vendor doing that. And it's extremely negative value add if you happen to get it wrong because you don't have the subject matter experts who are in the upstream. Developers get benefit if we enhance our test support, which is going to be one of the requisites of having something for a longer term support. But what are the risks and costs? So this changes the human staffing equation on things. Our test matrices grow. Instead of having the current 3 prior releases that we test Kubernetes against, maybe there would be more. And then you get added technical complexity. You have to ensure your APIs are stable over longer time spans, which again kind of goes back to that test matrix growth, but it's a test matrix interoperability challenge. And then you have to validate, you have to first plan for, code for, ensure that it should work, but test and validate that upgrading across distant releases actually works. And this is technically challenging and also costly. So as a working group, we're trying to do this with an open mind, go about the question of, should we do something different? And to understand the answer to that, as developers on Kubernetes, we can't just answer that question in a vacuum. So we put out a survey last fall. We spent kind of December and a bit of January crafting a survey of 20 plus questions. I think in hindsight, we realized for sure that it was too big of a survey, but we were trying to get information from people who do stuff with Kubernetes clusters, users of clusters, operators of clusters, those of us in the open source community who are developing the cluster code itself, but also software vendors, hosting providers, and kind of more broadly open source software contributors in the halo around Kubernetes. Because like if you look at the CNCF landscape document, there's hundreds at this point of other projects that interact with Kubernetes and may have some coupling or their own test and support interoperability that they want to mirror to what Kubernetes itself is doing. So we had about 600 people, a little over 600 people start the survey, and 334 actually filled it out. It was not the best ratio, but we broadcast the link all over the place, and we actually had a fairly high ratio of people who got past the first question. So I think people got the first page load maybe and were like, oh, this isn't actually for me. So the 334 we had was actually a fairly large portion once you count the people who went on into the survey. It's a pretty good number. I think KubeADM community had done a survey and had maybe 50-ish, 50, 100 sort of range of people responding. So at this point, this may be one of the largest survey responses we've gotten back in terms of trying to gauge how users are upgrading and moving their clusters forward. And it's also important to note that this is during Q1 of 2019 that people filled out the survey. We closed the survey in April, so Q1 2019, that would mean that the 1.13 release had just come out. So that'll show in some of the next slides. So who did we get responding? We had quite a bit of users of Kubernetes who responded, and then kind of split evenly in the other half. We had operators, contributors, distributors, hosts, and vendors. So a pretty good mix. I think if you look at that 300 plus number and count by this, we had 150, well actually if I do 40 by that, I don't know, somewhere over 100 who would fall into the contributor, distributor, hosting provider, vendor category, which is the people providing support. So we got a pretty significant number of folks who represent, realistically, companies who are trying to do support here. So hopefully we have some meaningful, I don't want to say like statistically accurate, there's no good way to judge this when it's kind of asking people their opinions, but we have a lot of representation relative to the size of the community, the vendor and support side community as well, but also users saying what they're looking for on the consumption side and the operators as well. So I really apologize for folks who are colorblind. This may be slightly awkward to see, but this is showing at the bottom releases that are less than version 1.10, and then it goes 1.10, 11, 12, 13. So 13 being the newest release. And for those who aren't familiar, when a release like 1.13 comes out, it becomes the newest supported, and then there are trailing ones. So 1.13, 1.12, 1.11 would have been in support at that point. So you can get a sense of, for folks who are operating clusters, they have a portion that are on non-supported Kubernetes clusters, but one of the things we were curious about was where this line falls. And for most of these, it's significant. It's not quite half, but maybe a third to a half of the things that they're running include older versions. So that's a sign that people are either choosing not to upgrade for reasons or struggling to upgrade for reasons. So we also asked about when they would like to do upgrades. So it's one thing what you're running, but you may be running old stuff and prefer to run faster and move faster, but not be able to for whatever reason. So we asked about how often would you like to, and how often are you successfully able to do minor upgrades. And I want to call out here, if you're used to semantic versioning, you might think major, minor, patch are the three numbers. In Kubernetes, we do that, but the one is basically fixed at this point. So I honestly believe, from a developer and user perspective, what we call a minor release, this 1.x, that this does amount to a major release from the user and consumer's perspective, frankly, honestly. So these are the big disruption points. We release a new one every quarter. And we sort of hypothesize that we might get a bimodal distribution here, and I think that's kind of what we've got. Some people are cool doing these upgrades quarterly, but that amounts to about half of the people who responded. Half of the people would like to go slower. And then patch upgrades the same question. So the .y, so if you're on 1.13 and 1.13.6 came out a week ago, how quickly are people consuming those? So some people are happy and interested to consume those basically immediately. As soon as they come out, they start trying to ingest them into whatever their pipeline is for local validation into their production clusters. But other people are doing things less frequently or maybe more deliberately. They may have certain change windows that are slower, or they may only upgrade a cluster in response to a specific bug. So the sort of, if it's not broken, why fix it mentality. But certainly, security is a response to that. You want to not react to the security flaw versus hopefully be patched. And I have a fairly limited number of slides here, so I'm hoping to make this kind of discussion, but I'll kind of churn through things and then we'll bounce the mic around, because a large part of what I want to do today is get a little more people involved and a little more discussion. KubeCon Seattle, we had a room of probably 50 plus people, and we're not quite bickering back and forth, but it was a lively discussion, and it could have gone on for hours, I would say. So I'd like to get more feedback from a broader set of folks here, even though it's a small room. So in the survey, we also talked about questioned what types of problems people were having. And we were looking at kind of technical and non-technical things. And ones that rated relatively high are there on the screen. But so I'll let you read those. The non-technical blockers I'll summarize as kind of the traditional IT sorts of friction points that amount to doing slower deployments in production. The technical ones I will summarize as this project is immature still. We're working on bettering our stabilization and bringing more of our APIs to a stable point, but there's a huge amount of flux and change going on all the time. And that impacts our downstream users ultimately. And you see that in the data, the types of things that they worried about. And then we also we tried to get at a little more explicitly what people are looking for out of the range of possibilities. And within the working group and those of us in the support ecosystem and who've done things like Linux distro support in our past, things like that, we all have our own opinions and biases on what we think is the right way to do this. But the question is, what do the users want? And one of the things that rated really highly was seamless in-place upgrade. We've wondered whether we should do upgrades as like an immutable infrastructure type of a thing. Don't upgrade a node, kill the node, replacing it with something newer. Users didn't seem particularly interested in that today. Maybe it's because it's a new paradigm, or maybe not. They want a well-documented release cycle and a gradual rollout and a way to carefully and controlled move their cluster nodes forward. They definitely want to see the REST APIs moving to stable v1. And at the end of the day, they want to be able to run their apps without having to change them. If a new Kubernetes release comes out, they want to continue to run their apps just as they had before. They'd like it to be transparent. And I think we would like that also. We talk about containers as sort of an easy way to run stuff, but if it's every quarter you're rewriting some portion of something because you've maybe inadvertently coupled your application to the platform, then we're doing this whole microservices thing wrong. So in terms of upgrade cadence options, what we've talked about, to kind of give a little bit of background, the working group only formed late last year, early this year, with the idea that we would do a time-boxed investigation. We'll run a survey, we'll kind of draft up some change proposals around how we do support as a project, try to also improve test-related things, and try to help focus activity on key API solidifying and moving more things towards v1 stable 1. But at the end of the day, the question is, like, should we change the build and release cadence and force people to follow that? And would that mean faster or slower upgrades? Or also there's been a question, could we do faster and slower? So what does that look like? We have 2 documents out there that we've been drafting. This is the first one, the short link there. This is what I'd call the faster and slower variant. And this is a eye chart, I think. But the gist is that you have 2 sort of branches. What we have today for Kubernetes, you might think of as a devel branch in this way. It's sitting there iterating, and the person who's kind of drafted this up had suggested that maybe it releases every month. So Kubernetes starts releasing faster, but we do that for 11 months, spend a month then, instead of working on features for that month cycle, we focus just on stability, and that leads into forking off a stable branch, and that stable branch then gets something for a longer support. This is a model that's existed in other open source projects and in other software products as well in history and out there in the ecosystem today. So this is a potentially viable model. There's a big document with all sorts of details there. And then there's one that's kind of the one that I'll say is the slower variant. Again, the short link there, but the idea here is to say that you could actually do this today. Right now, we only support upgrades between adjacent versions. But if you wanted to, like say we hypothetically declared that 1.15 was LTS, and then later, like a year later, we made a LTS plus 1 and called 1.21 LTS. kubeadm enables you today to do a sequential visit of all those intervening steps and get to 1.21. This would be a kind of ugly way to do it, but this is functionally possible if we were to do something simple and plain. And it's an idea just to throw out there. Again, sort of open mind, not being prescriptive as a working group. And then within those is the question of in place or not. And just to make sure that we're on the same page word-wise. So if you've got your nodes host in OS and you're running something like 1.13.6 for your Kubernetes control plane, you upgrade that Kubernetes control plane software to 1.14.2. That's what would be in place. This is a normal software update. You've got a machine that's running, you run an updater software that changes a portion of the software on that machine. If we went with immutable infrastructure, this 1.13.6 Kubernetes host combination, once deployed, we would not want to touch and mutate. Any mutation would cause a new one. So this you could imagine maybe being a virtual machine image. So you bring up a new node. Oops, and I'm going to mutate my slide on immutable infrastructure. That should be 1.14.2, obviously. So this would be kind of right now. If 1.13.6 was the newest 1.13, you're on it, you decide, okay, 1.14.2's come out, I never run .0 or .1 releases, I'm ready to upgrade. You build up and test a new image, and when it's happy, you introduce it into your cluster, and you kill off a prior node. Some people have worried that this type of a path requires a lot more infrastructure, but at its most basic, it requires one more node than you're running today. So with that kind of 20-minute intro using half the time, I want to throw this out for discussion. Again, the link if you want to engage beyond today in the working group. But what are folks in the room doing? What are your thoughts?
I have a question, Tim.
I'm going to ask you all to use the mic because we are recording this.
Yeah. So my question is on the how often do you take releases and patches question. Did we do that just for users, or did we do that for distros, etc. also?
So originally we were thinking about splitting out separate surveys for the different personas, and we ended up with just a single one, so everybody answered the same set of questions, with the first one being an indicator on their persona. And then we asked if you were trying to, if you feel multiple personas match what you do, to if you'd be, pick the most important one first, but please fill it out multiple times if you feel like it, so we capture as much as possible.
I have a follow-up. Since it went that way, do we have or can we get a breakdown, for example, of the patches question? One of the things I'm really interested as a product manager is a breakdown of the patches frequency question for distros.
We need to double check that we have so we have like a huge spreadsheet. It's like 600 by 50 rows.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that there's nothing PII in there, but yes, we intend to make the fully anonymized info available for the community, and we can build more charts and stuff like that as well.
I don't think distros specifically was one of the category. We used more generally. Well, no, we used, you had Kubernetes distros, right? It was a category, yeah. Not OS distros, though.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
I mean Kubernetes.
Okay.
For some cloud providers, we may do some enhancements in the Kubernetes code base sometimes. For example, we want to have some extra features that owns to a specific cloud provider, and terrible things happens if you rebase. Yeah, for example, it's especially when the enhancements accumulates, then hundreds of commits. Yeah, but I do think that it's part of the Kubernetes lifecycle. How do you think the LTS will resolve the case? Help the case?
Yeah. So welcome to being a vendor. One of the things that I think the steering committee for Kubernetes really wants to ensure is that we don't fracture. We need to ensure that Kubernetes means something. If we get too far apart, then users will have poor experience, and Kubernetes doesn't mean a single thing. It becomes sort of a forest of things, and the user has a much poorer experience. Towards that end, there is conformance testing that assures that Kubernetes means something. The coverage is admittedly short in conformance testing, and we need to work on solidifying the core APIs, stabilizing them, ensuring that they're covered with conformance. But beyond that, there should be room for people to do local customization. And the current pattern is to try to get more of that out of tree, decoupled from the core Kubernetes, structure things so that you can run as a cloud provider. And I'm curious if there's a specific one you're talking about to put you on the spot. The cloud providers should be able to run at their own cadence and do so safely, implement new features, and not have to try to wedge things into the core. But again, things are maybe a little immature for that just yet today. But ideally, in the future, that won't be so much a problem. If we are going to have a well-supportable, longer span of time, then we have to have interfaces that are stable enough that both vendors and distributors and support entities can do their value add without having to do these big complicated rebases. The other thing with sort of just my generic open source advocacy hat on that I would say is you should have CI. You shouldn't just have to rebase, you should constantly be rebasing. And even though Kubernetes releases on a 3-month cycle, the day, the moment, the second that a git commit comes into master that's broken you, because it arguably broke you, right? It broke some assumption that you had where you had working code, you should be able to immediately open an issue or start interacting with the open source community around that so that we can know that we did that and collaborate on a fix. If you completely fork off to the side and do your own thing, you're going to always be in that type of pain. But can I put you on the spot? Which cloud provider do you have in mind? So I'll admit, I work for VMware. We have the same problem, right? Everybody does. The canonical people do. Susa, you do as well, right?
Yeah, we definitely do.
Red Hat does. We got all the bigs in the room. We all know that this is a problem, and that's why we're here together to talk. So it's safe.
Yeah. So we are, okay. So basically I stand for Alibaba.
Alibaba. Okay, yeah. In Shanghai last fall, I spoke with some folks from Alibaba as well, yeah.
Yes. We tried, literally we tried everything to make the change out of the tree, but it's almost impossible. Like there are some changes coupled into the Kubernetes code base. We tried that, but there's still hundreds of commits left out there. And that's really painful.
Yeah. So one thing in the cloud provider SIG, we worked with SIG testing on extending the test grid functionality, so you can run conformance tests in your own environment or more tests and submit back to test grid. And
that's another issue, I think. That's testing against the Kubernetes cluster behavior is another thing. What we are caring about here is code-wisely, how do we manage the code tree, the Git tree of the Kubernetes vendors at the Kubernetes vendor side? Yeah, we have to. I mean, we have to ensure that consistency in the conformance test.
So Jago in the back had mentioned test grid. So just for folks who maybe aren't familiar, testgrid.kates.io, you get this UI, and there's a conformance section. And I'm gonna admit, I think I don't like the results here. Yeah. But so you can see GCE is present, OpenStack is present. The reason I'm sad is vSphere is showing red right now, some failures. But the more cloud providers we get in here, the more signal we get to the project when the project breaks something. And it's important to try to contribute to that.
Thank you.
yeah, we really need that signal, as most of us are testing in one specific environment and totally unintentionally can break everybody else or somebody else. And likewise, that goes in multiple directions. So it's really important to the portability of workloads.
And your description of the complexity of managing your own patches, if nothing else, there's like that mental cognitive load on the project people trying to understand all of the different contexts in each of these cloud providers that they might be impacting. And each of us can't hardly understand our own stack. It's so complicated, much less all of them in parallel. So this type of signal is really huge. Well, I think we have 5 minutes left officially, but anybody else have a question?
Tim, sorry, just to jump in, the slide on what the responses were about upgrade cadence, I remember there were several questions on that in the survey. And this says, when do you upgrade? And you characterized it as, when do you want to upgrade? What is this data coming from specifically?
So I honestly need to double check that. It's been a crazy couple of weeks with conferences, and somebody else made this slide, one of the other folks in the SIG, and when I saw it, I had the exact same question. So I'm not sure if this was the when do you upgrade or when do you want to. I think it's the when do you want to.
Okay, I think that's super important, and it would be great
Yes.
to schedule another one of these.
Yeah, so
and
this-
see what
we-
the trending direction is over time.
Yeah, we just got this and have made these first couple of graphs, and in I believe the next working group meeting, we will be trying to present a lot more. We'll get the raw data out there so people can crunch it and look at it from different directions. And then, this is something that periodically we should do to judge, especially if we end up making a change to the support stance, or if we propose something and enact it, then we really need to, after a period of time, redo this and see, did we help or did we make it worse?
Yeah, that would be great. Totally different direction. I really appreciate that you have multiple times for the SIG meeting. I think that's a good pattern that other SIG should follow as well. Sadly, neither time has worked out for me personally, so Jordan's been going a lot, I think.
And just to mention, so a lot of the SIG meetings, if you're familiar with the Kubernetes community, a lot of them happen morning specific time, and we have an afternoon meeting normally, but then we also have one that's like, I don't know, I'm West Coast US also, but for me it's middle of the night, and it works out to reasonable for Europe and okay for Asia. So we're trying to bring in more broader interactions.
Yeah, so definitely applaud that. But one of the things that Jordan passed on to me was that there were some other constraints around LTS for Kubernetes based on its dependencies, the Go language, some of the packages that we import, and the transitive implications of LTS for Kubernetes. Can you talk more about some of that?
Yeah, I would say in a way that's kind of how I first came at this issue on the release team. One, people were saying they were unhappy, but at the end of the day, there was only so much I could do in my one release cycle to worry about getting the release out. And this came up at I think the end of 1.10, right before we were going to do the release. Somebody said, oh, we forgot to update the dependencies list for the release notes. So everybody's like, well, what are our dependencies? And we're searching, there's 100 different files you got to look at to find what versions of what things got tested. And that was the kind of the aha moment to me, like, oh, wait, Tim Hawken and Brian Grant back at KubeCon in Austin did a talk about, is Kubernetes a kernel or a distro? And that was my aha moment, seeing that list of all of those dependencies and the specific versions to say, oh, we're kind of a distro already. And I feel at this point we need more distro-minded people who are used to operating distros to get involved in the release and support process to help us manage that, because it's not the most common skill. And you see the same patterns of mistakes repeated, at least based on the half dozen distros I've worked on for Linux in my career.
The problem for some of this stuff is because we actually discussed just Golang as a dependency. And the problem is that Golang only supports back 6 months, I believe.
It's a year.
It's a year? Okay.
Yeah.
But it's a year based on Golang version. We don't necessarily upgrade to the newest Golang version right away, so it's often a lot less than a year for us. And so then the question is to say, hey, what does it mean to have this LTS version of Kubernetes that's, say, 2 years old, if it's based on a Golang version that's no longer supported by the Go community? And then we have our usual choice. Speaking of somebody who worked for a company that does OS distros, it's the usual unpalatable choice that OS distros have always faced, which is, do we maintain our own patch set for that, or do we force users to upgrade under the hood? And both of those alternatives are unpalatable in different ways.
And in building distros, it's the depends on and depended on by hook. One of the, it's no secret that the SUSE supported product line as opposed to OpenSUSE is not exactly drowning in bleeding edge adopters most of the time. And that's kind of a conflict with Kubernetes philosophy at this point. So the real paradox that we see is that almost everybody I shouldn't say almost everybody, it's certainly a prevailing trend among customers and other evaluators is people want to start on current and then have a support window, and the next guy wants to start on the next quarters, and that's the challenge with the long-term support track.
Well, and for me, that's the beauty of the immutable architecture, or that If you take containers and think of them as immutable software infrastructure, if you take that one level down the host and treat the host like that, you get that choice. You deploy something and you can keep it around for a while, and then you kill it off and you manage. You don't have to manage a whole set of risks. In particular, like on this, where is that picture? One of the major issues that Jordan Liggett, who Jago mentioned, he brought up, in this picture on the left, our most common thing that we hear about is you're starting to roll something out and there's an issue and you have to roll back. Partially, like in an RPM space, you've partially applied a RPM and you need to un-RPM install it. This sort of stuff is really tricky when you are mutating systems that don't have great handling for that, especially in the backward direction where the upgrade software is meant to move you forward. And the same goes for all of the internal data structure. Even if you go with just this type of movement on the right, you still have the internal data that needs to have been versioned and have translation mechanisms to support that. So it's not just a silver bullet moving to the right. You still have to have code and data managed in a way that enables that. But I feel like if we agree that that were the goal, we could focus on just that part of the puzzle. Where today, most of the work is going into building a mechanism to do the thing on the left. And we still have that data issue. Well, we are a minute over time, I think, and I have something I have to run to in 4 minutes to present at again. So thank you all for coming. I really beg you all, if this is of any interest to you, please come get involved in the SIG. Share your ideas. We need more hands on deck, especially doing things like enhancing test cases and getting better test coverage. So thank you all.